Hello everybody, my name is Jonathan Frappier and welcome to the professionalvmware.com vBrownBag on this unfoolingest of days, Wednesday, April 22nd, 2014, an actual vBrownBag tonight, unlike my mistake last night. Tonight we have Brian Suhr talking about the VCAP-DTD blueprint, part 2 in our mini-series. Brian, how's it going with you tonight?
I'm doing real good, and I think I'm all ready to kick this thing off tonight.
Excellent. So Brian's going to be covering sections 1 and 2 of the blueprint. Is that right?
Yep, that's what I'm down for. That's what I made slides for, so that's what we're getting regardless. So.
Awesome. That sounds good. A few quick show notes. Hop in on the conversation by raising your hand in the GoToMeeting app. I'll unatwell you, and you can ask your question live. You can also pop it into the question window or drop a tweet with the vBrownBag hashtag. I'll do my best to balance all of those bits flying around. You can catch our other live shows, APAC, EMEA, Latin America, and of course our shows here that we're live on tonight on Wednesdays. If you can't make all the live shows but you're interested in the content, you can always catch up with the recordings on iTunes and just our generic feed, bit.ly/brownbag iTunes and bit.ly/brownbag podcast. You can find Brian tonight at VSur on Twitter. And with that, I have nothing else yet, so pass it over to you if I can remember how to do that. Make presenter. And you should now be the presenter.
All right. I haven't done GoToMeeting as much as WebEx. Is it showing just everything there?
I've got your PowerPoint window. Looks like it's ready to go into presenter mode.
Let me shrink this thing.
Yep, that looks good.
All right. It's coming up fine?
Looks great.
Okay, so good evening, everybody. Here's a few bits about me. I'm going to be talking about desktop design, or the VCAP desktop design certification. Like mentioned earlier, I'll be doing sections 1 and 2. I try to follow the blueprint as closely as possible and kind of give you some nuggets and things that I think would be worthwhile to study. So we'll talk through a lot of these and then kind of give you some stuff that you can take away and do a little bit more research on. There's a few places that I'm at. You can find me on Twitter at that address and a couple of blogs that I blog for. So if you like what I have to say, go ahead and check them out. I'd appreciate it. Let's get started. And then I tend to kind of ramble and speak fast with these things, so the more interactive, the better. And I'll do my best to not go too fast. So section 1 talks about conceptual design for view. So identifying business requirements for your view design. So this is really kind of pertinent to any type of design where we're going to, collaborate with the customer and do our interrogation and kind of get the details that we need for our design. So right off the bat, I thought the most important thing, or at least I feel the most important thing, is to get right with end-user computing is use cases. There's kind of two main themes in end-user computing. It's use cases and applications. So if you don't get the use cases right, the rest of it's going to be pretty hard. So I kind of harp on that. So we need to figure out what these use cases are, and these might be business units. They might be a job task within the company. You kind of develop what a use case is. It's a set of common requirements or users that have similar needs. So I've listed some samples here, like a task worker, a nurse, might be a developer, etc. And then we need to figure out what the requirements for these use cases are. So do they need a certain type of application? Do they need a certain size virtual machine? Do they need remote access? There's a ton of different things that we'll kind of talk about here that kind of all get rolled up, and then we figure out what the requirements are for those use cases, and that helps us further on the design, figure out other things that we're doing. We also need to figure out what our physical requirements are. So compute, network, storage, those type of common virtualization resources, what we'll need to do this type of design. You need a starting size. So are they going to start with 50 users, 500 users? What do we expect this to grow out to be? So maybe we start with 500 it's expected to reach 5,000 at what point, so maybe in 3 years. So that helps us understand how we will scale it. Maybe they're going to scale it every 6 months, they're going to add 500 users or whatever their path is, because that, for me, that plays in on how we architect it. And, I think last week Adam talked about blocks and pods in view design. So that kind of plays in with how you would scale it. You could build blocks of infrastructure and resources and scale view accordingly. Constraints, and this is kind of a common architecture, so we need to identify constraints, risks, and assumptions for our view project and what those would be and how they might affect it. We need to know about their data centers and remote office locations. Since it's end-user computing, it's not just the data center, it's all the other sites. It's if we have workers out in the field that might be on the road or in a Starbucks, where would they be accessing this? So we need to know, would this infrastructure be in a single data center? Do they need a DR data center? Do we have 5 remote offices or 500, and where are they across the globe? So we need to kind of really come up with that map of what their sites look like. Do they have any space constraints in the data center that might affect how you do your infrastructure for that? And I'm not probably real good at watching the chat thing there, Jonathan, so if you see questions in there, just interrupt me and I'll try to answer them as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got got it all open and watched them.
Okay, and then obviously VMware products. So the VCAP, at least this one, is primarily focused on just view, and then probably a little bit of Synapse. I think it's how the blueprint works. So it's not the entire Horizon suite. It's really not end-user computing yet. It's just virtual desktops is really what we're focused on for this. And then obviously some vSphere, vCenter type of infrastructure that would go below it. You're going to need to know what type of endpoints the customer has. So are they PC, Mac, Linux, mobile? Do they have thin clients, or do they want to use thin clients? We need to figure out what they have today and what they would like to use in the future. Do they need to have external access? So will people outside of corporate locations be accessing this? And then how might they want to access that? Would they like to use the view security servers? Will they force them to use VPNs, or is there some other method that they might use, like F5 load balancers or something like that? You need to know if they're going to need to enforce two-factor authentication. So View does support Radius technology, and I think just about anything that supports Radius will probably work. So will you require users externally to enter a second credential to get authenticated? All right, next up is determine availability and reliability requirements. So these are kind of separate entries in the blueprint, but they really, to me, mash very closely together, so I tried to fit them on one slide here. Of course, we need to understand what the RTO and RPO requirements are for the customer. So this ties into, how often does it need to be available, and for reliability, I need to have a target. Am I shooting for 3 nines or 5 nines? And that all is going to affect my design and some of the points that we'll talk about here. When would the solution be available? So this is maybe it's a hospital where it's 24/7, 365. They don't ever get, technically a minute off. They're shooting for as close to 100% uptime for some of this as possible. Or it might be some type of a corporate environment where it's just weekdays from 9 to 5. So we need to understand that, because that will help us architect for our availability. And then depending on what those requirements are, we need to look at different ways that we can meet this availability. So how can we increase the availability at different points in the infrastructure? So might there be a reason to use vCenter Heartbeat to protect vCenter or Composer or the databases for some different pieces of this? Load balancing for my connection and security servers would allow me to increase availability there. And what about network shares, right? So we're going to have user profile, we're going to have user data, and we're going to have a FinApp repository, which is generally just a CIF share. So I'm going to need to be able to meet my requirements there for that. So I also need to look at what the requirements would be for uptime and availability, and not forget these different pieces. And then of course there's compute and storage. So if I need 6 nines or 5 nines or whatever crazy goal we're going for, I can't pick a Synology and put my stuff on there, right? I'm not going to be able to meet that with that. And also for compute layer. So if I need 5 nines of availability, which is I think something like 7 minutes a year or something, N+1 might not be good enough for my clusters. So when we look at the compute layer, we're going to look at how we build out our clusters. So what level of redundancy we do. We need how many nodes can have failure before I take a degradation in performance. If it's blades, for example, or even rack mounts, how would I stripe my nodes amongst different racks within the data center, if they're blades in different chassis to look at these failure domains. I'm going to have typical best practice for View and most, say, modern VMware infrastructures. For something like this that would be greenfield is I'm typically going to build a management cluster, so that's going to be my View servers, my vCenters for this, VCOps, anything that's dedicated to managing my View infrastructure. I will typically build in a management cluster. So I've got the availability requirements for that, and I've also got the resource clusters where my View desktops are going to run. So I've got to consider all those. And then the storage layer. So how can I protect those LUNs or NFS shares or whatever technology I pick? So how am I going to handle path failure or controller failure or data store failure? And architect for performance versus how I handle those failures. The network speed, so I'm going to need to know how much network I need and be able to provide ample enough uplinks so that if I should, say, have half of my network fail, if it's a dual home or dual core network, that I can still perform without any major interruptions in service. Next up is manageability requirements. So I create this highly available, super cool View design, but if I make it extremely hard to manage, it's not going to make some people pretty hard. So I like to keep it simple, stupid phrase. So we want to remove complexity, whenever possible. So I don't want to add extra effort just because, vCenter Heartbeat might be really cool, but I don't have a technical requirement that I need to meet that I needed. So I try to remove those extra layers, images, clusters. Maybe I don't need 6 resource clusters. I can accomplish it with 4 or, whatever, it may be. So within the environment, I'm always looking to kind of keep it as simple as possible, but still meet my requirements. So who's going to manage the environment? So desktops is a bit of a unique case because they're kind of like the weird cousin that nobody wants to hang out with. You've got vSphere involved, you've got applications involved, and you've got desktops involved. And I've seen a lot of companies kind of approach it like that. They stand up this infrastructure and they give the the vSphere piece to the server team that does the servers already. They kind of tag the desktop team with the desktop images, and View kind of gets forgotten about a lot of the time, and nobody really wants to touch it. And if something goes wrong, they reset a desktop or they restart the broker or something, but it's kind of like hands-off. I mean, a lot of companies don't plan and put the effort forward into figuring out how they'll kind of make a unified team or possibly a totally new team that has these skills needed to manage this type of environment. And also, is there some type of a method or a tool that we're going to be able to troubleshoot this environment for? So you're probably used to doing virtualization. You're used to doing desktops the old-fashioned way, which typically you aren't really troubleshooting PCs. There's not really a big need for that. So when we move to View, there is a need to be well-informed. We've got the user sessions and the actual performing of the virtual machine. So we either need to have some type of existing tool that can help us manage that, or maybe we need to specifically bring in some tool for us to help us do that. And don't add extra products if they're not needed. So if the requirements don't support it, like I was saying, don't stuff Heartbeat in. Don't toss in like Microsoft clusters or protect a database or something that might not be officially supported or not needed to meet some requirements. create non-standard type failure scenarios by architecting a cluster, maybe weird that doesn't have shared storage or something. If the needs don't demand it, don't do it. So interoperability requirements. So whenever you add something new in the stack, now we've got something else to think about. So it's not just vSphere and vCenter anymore. We've obviously still got those, but now we've got View, we've got ThinApp, we've got a desktop operating system, we've got agents, and potentially an antivirus solution and possibly other things. So based upon the requirements and what that will help kind of drive the potential version of these applications that you would need, but based upon the version of View that you would select, the customer may say, well, I want View 5.2, but they're really, think vSphere 5.5 is awesome and they just love it. But do those two products work together? So you got to check those compatibility matrices, make sure that they are compatible. If they're not, then that's going to drive your choice on one of those products. And then also, if it was an upgrade, you can't just run off and do that vSphere upgrade because you may break View, so you have to pay extra close attention to versions here. So are they all supported? Are they compatible? Does one product version offer features that the customer has requirements are? So maybe they need some latest feature that's in View 5.3 is the latest, but they're really keen on an older version, let's say 5.0 of vSphere, and maybe 5.3 View doesn't support it, so that you may have to push the customer forward on the vSphere version, for example. And then also we have to deal with the client versions, so the actual View client that are on these endpoints. Make sure that they're compatible. There's a much better range for that for compatibility, but do they support the version that you're installing? Does the version that's going to be installed on the endpoints, does it support all of the needed functionality? Does it do the audio bypass? Does it do local caching? Whatever you need to get the performance. And then there's the third-party products. There's backup products. There's antivirus. There's single sign-on. There's the digital loss prevention, and probably a half dozen other ones that I'm figuring out. So typically, these are probably more of a problem than the VMware products because they do a pretty good job of keeping their stuff within a couple product ranges. But we may pick the latest versions of the VMware products, but McAfee might not support it for 6 months or a year, for example, that they're trailing for their antivirus product. Next up would be security requirements. So this one can be, something that customers might be trying to use View to solve some security issues. Or View may cause security issues in some environments because it's this radically new way to serve up desktops, and that kind of freaks out those security guys. So you're going to need to identify what their requirements are. Who can have access to desktops externally, for example? How would you control that? Are you going to let everybody have them, or are we going to implement tags inside of View so that the pools that are tagged can only access that? What are we going to do for USB access on the endpoint? So when I connect up with a device, am I going to allow them to use any and all types of USB devices? Or will I not allow them to use any, or can they use anything but just not, say, like a USB storage device so they can't copy data out? Are you going to allow copy and paste? How about endpoint encryption? So are we going to enforce them that they have to encrypt their endpoint, or do we even care if they encrypt their endpoint? Local mode. One of the most questioned about features that I always get asked about, because the idea of being able to check out a desktop is incredibly sexy to companies for some reason, but nobody ever does it. I've never had a customer implement it. But if they were going to use it, how would we secure that? What would our options be? So, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a couple later slides. And what are our options to enforce these type of policies? So we can set a number of policies in View Manager itself, and then what can we do via GPO? So is there a default Windows-based group policy that we can use? Or VMware provides a number of administrative templates that can be loaded into Active Directory that give us more fine-grained control over these USB and bandwidth type settings for View. All right, so next up would be desktop personas and user experience. So the piece that the end users, really care about. So regardless of how we architect the infrastructure on the backside and how we do the pools, the end user just wants the same user experience each time they log into their desktop, whether they log into the same pool, get a different desktop every time they log in. It's just got to look the same. It's got to look the same. They want the picture of their dog in the background. They want the same applications. It's all got to be there. So how are we going to do that? We need to manage their profile in some way, and there's a number of different ways that we could do this. Vue has persona management built into it. That can be controlled via group policy and those templates that I spoke in the last slide about. We could use roaming profiles from Microsoft. We could use mandatory profiles, in Windows. Or we could use local profiles, whether it's like a full clone, just a persistent VM, that I keep their profile in that VM and it really acts more like a traditional desktop. Or we could use a personal disk inside of Vue where that disk attaches to their VM and their profile is stored on there. So not a big fan of that one, but it's certainly an option and there's a bit more legacy, I think, these days than it was in the past. What will our users need? Well, they need more than one profile. Like, will somebody need access to different OS versions? Maybe I have to do some of my job and has an application that can only be on a Windows XP machine, and the rest of the time I'm going to work on a Windows 7 version. They might have just different job duties that may require them to have different desktops, so they may need separation for security, job duties. Maybe they work for two different divisions in the company. Could be a number of reasons that might drive something like this. And will they need more than one profile, like if they have a physical or a virtual, or can I manage the same profile for both? And then Windows 7 experience, for example, how will we treat their desktop? Or are we going to allow them to have some form of 3D graphics? Will we support the use of Arrow in Windows 7 or other experience items like that? How do we want that virtual desktop experience to behave for them? Next up would be mobility requirements. So back to local mode. So do we have a real need for local mode access? So local mode access allows me, depending on the type of pool and how I set it up, I can give users the ability to actually check out their desktop. So they have a version of the Vue client that's the local mode supported, which to me basically has a stripped down version of VMware Workstation in it. It actually downloads my virtual machine onto my endpoint, and then I'm allowed to run it locally on my laptop for that. So there's, that's still only supported on a Windows endpoint today. It's a bit of time to check that thing in and out, which is not really exciting to most people. And security, so that virtual machine is encrypted when I check it out, and there's different levels of encryptions. I think the default is 128-bit, but I think you can turn it up to 256-bit if you wanted to. What would that value need to be? There's also a timeout value, so if that checked out machine does not sync back in and contact the Vue servers within a certain period of time, it will lock the person out of that desktop until it can check back in for them. So there's not a nuke like with a mobile device where I could wipe it, but I can, if they haven't checked in 30 days, I cannot allow them to log into it anymore. And then application delivery is a big kind of piece that affects this too. So if I check that desktop out and they're quote-unquote offline, then they can't access most applications. So if we were presenting them applications via ThinApp or maybe they were a XenApp customer, if they're offline, they can't access them. So they should know that. But if they want applications in there, then I either have to install additional applications in my base image, or I have to actually locate my ThinApp packages into their image. And then that's a bit more to keep updated because I can't just update my image in the repository. Now I've got it on a bunch of these VMs that get checked out. So there's some application consideration there also. And then how am I going to enforce the check-in, check-out policy? So I can allow people to manually, say, sync my changes. I can set a schedule where it'll sync back their updates to keep their copy in the data center up to date on a schedule. So I've got to consider those. And then there's training. So teaching them how, to check in and out. You have to set expectations about how much time that would take if they're in the office or versus out of the office, so that you don't kind of shoot yourself in the foot with that user experience. If they're on a mobile device, I think Unity Touch is supported on both iOS and Android devices today. And what Unity Touch is, it's VMware trying to bridge the gap between a point-and-click operating system like Windows and a touch device. So anybody who's tried to work on a Windows desktop on, say, an iPad, it's not something you would want to do every day for long periods of time. It can bridge the gap, but it's not a great experience. So Unity Touch adds some more touch-based interface where you can swipe from the side and it brings up a menu, and that menu is much more accustomed to what you'd see on a mobile device. And you can see your recent documents. You can see your whole start menu there. And it's a much better experience than trying to, click on the start menu and weed your way through there to find the application. So they're setting expectations around that, of course, and then showing them how to use that interface. And then delivering applications to mobile devices. This is, a challenge for VMware right now because ThinApp can't directly deliver an application to a mobile device. So I have to present that app to a Windows VM and then present them the VM to their mobile device. So they have to use a view desktop and just ensuring that people understand that. All right, I think this is the last piece for section 1 is the ROI and TCO tool. So I wouldn't expect probably that there would be a lot of content around this, but this tool is available at that link from VMware, and it's a pretty in-depth tool. I mean, this takes you through on, and it's kind of good just to run through it so you kind of figure out what, these return on investment type values. So there's a lot of, obviously, the cost of the software and the licensing, the hardware costs in there, but there's also a lot of time where it talks about labor, and if you switch to thin clients versus PCs, there's time difference in management and obviously the cost. So there's a bunch of questions that it asks, and then at the end it spits out, hey, you could expect to pay this much more or save, hopefully save this much more by doing it this way, and here's how it breaks down over 3, 5, or whatever your period that you pick. So I kind of just blasted my way through it and took that screenshot. But I would suggest that you run through that at least once so you kind of understand all the types of values that go into some type of calculation like that.
Is anyone able to sign up for that, or do you have to be like a partner? Or?
So that is in any one product. So you will have to create a login. It kind of appears like it's part of the VMware login, but I tried a few of my regular logins and they didn't work, so I had to sign up for another login. But it is just an anyone tool. It's not a partner tool or anything like that. And it works for both vSphere, and then there's a track for end-user computing, but it's just view-focused right now, and it's, I would say it's pre-Horizon Suite view, so they talk about Premier versus standard licensing, which they've done away with that in the latest one, but so I don't think it's been updated for a year or so at least.
Cool, thanks.
All right, there's that. So current workflow. So this is really about understanding what their current desktop experience is about. So I need to, if I'm doing an end-user computing project like this, I need to understand how the users work today in their use cases. So are the users using a thin client today? Are they a PC user, a laptop user? Which apps are they using? How often do they do that? Are they using any type of peripherals? So, I do a lot with like hospitals. So are they doing dictation? Do they have cameras, mics, printers, special kind of scanners, little things like signature pads? I have to account for all these things, and then we need to test and make sure that they're compatible. Do they have need for multiple monitors? What OS versions are they using today? So there's quite a bit of discovery into their current environment. Excuse me. Do they run or have the need to run multiple versions of a single app? So do they need 2 versions of Office, 3 versions of a browser? How will I do with that? Will it be one baked in the image and then the rest all thin apps? So you need to kind of figure out how you'll account for that. What's their login experience like? like today? So do they have multiple logins to log into before they get to a desktop, or do they have some type of single sign-on service already? Do they walk up with a badge and tap it or slide it in or something? Because I'm going to need to see if that's compatible with View, and then I want to make their login process better or faster rather than more complicated. So I had a recent customer that it took them, if they rebooted their laptop, it might take them a half hour before they were re-logged in and at the desktop today. So obviously that was a huge problem for them that they were trying to experience. But they had a disk encryption login that they would have to log in, and they weren't passing like AD credentials to it, so then they would log in again to their OS, and it had a number of other checks and things that it would go through. Pretty extreme case, but definitely something to be aware of. So next would be network bandwidth requirements. So we need to understand what type of bandwidth is available in the data center to start. So from my servers that I'm going to either have today or will have, I need to know what kind of bandwidth is available to the switches. So is it 1 gig? Is it 10 gig? Are they constrained on ports? What type of a bandwidth I'm going to have to any storage solution that we pick? And then also what kind of bandwidth do I have from desktops to the data center? So I had one customer that was an old building in Chicago that literally still had basically Cat 2 networking to all their cubes. So it was 10 megabit networking to all their desktops. So it was extremely expensive to pull new cables, so they weren't going to do that. So it was a toss-up of, do we continue to use that, or do they move everybody to Wi-Fi? But when they moved everybody to Wi-Fi, kind of limited them on the thin clients that they wanted to choose. So got to understand bandwidth. And also, real important is if you have those remote sites that we talked about earlier, what kind of bandwidth and latency do I have between those remote sites and my data center? So if my data center is in the U.S. and all my sites in the U.S., I'm typically not too worried about this unless I have like clinics in the remote parts of Illinois or some densely populated state, which does happen. But if I'm in most major metropolitan areas, you've got pretty good bandwidth, and I'm not too concerned. But if I locate my data center in the U.S., but I've got developers in India, that potentially could be something that needs to be addressed. Number one thing is you need to do analysis on the current user environment. So I'm going to kind of talk about this in the next few slides, but what really this comes down to is, much like the discovery, we kind of talked about the other one, we're understanding what their user experience is. Well, we also need to know how their current environment performs. So around networking on those desktops, how much bandwidth does the average user consume, through application usage, and how might that change or increase if we virtualize them and put them in the data center? And there's tools to help for this. How much bandwidth would be required for a PC over IP session for a user? So how would we calculate this? There's obviously some values that VMware puts out there, some averages. To me, the best way to test this is to set up some kind of a test, whether it's in a lab or hopefully right in the current, the customer's data center, where we could test their use cases out with their sites, because everybody's network is a bit different. So we can actually run some real values and run tests and get this type. If they're an existing customer, then you've got some historical data to look at, hopefully. And then if virtualizing the PCs will change kind of the bandwidth equation. So maybe they're all physical PCs today, and they have local servers or apps in their remote site, and then they also go to the data center for some. So if I take the PC essentially and move it back to the data center via virtual desktop, but then if so I've got that bandwidth to account for, but then if they have to come back to the remote site for a file share or an application, that's not ideal. So then can those items be also moved back to the data center, or how will that change your bandwidth equation to account to? And that's fairly common, I've seen. Identify storage requirements. So I got to do that analysis of the current user environment. So you can take averages. You can say, oh, every user is going to use 25 IOPS because I've read 20 white papers that did that. but you're still kind of guessing, right? And you may be guessing high, low, not even close. The best way to do it is to actually run some type of tool or extended study on what a sampling of each use case within my design is. So if I've got 10 use cases, I need to look at a few units inside of each use case. So I can see what the average amount of storage capacity and performance that a nurse might use versus a developer and so on. And I'm going to identify the peaks. Are there any hot, peak points in the day or a certain part of the month like that? I need, a sampling over a course of time. I'm going to need to know the size of the images so that I can figure out, total capacity for the number of desktops and sizes that I need. Also, the number of images could potentially affect that also. So the more images I have, the less I can combine pools to save on space, so that accounts for my capacity. Am I going to be using some type of a dedicated or shared storage solution? So dedicated meaning that it's just used for view, it's just for virtual desktops. Or are we potentially just going to have to try to steal some capacity from an existing unit? Because that will definitely affect on what our design could scale or how it might perform. And also local storage options. So are you considering local storage? So might you be putting flash or like a Fusion I/O card in the local servers? So what kind of a performance could you use, but also how is that going to affect, like an HA failover? Is it even possible? Will it require me to architect my availability a bit different to still achieve my availability, because I won't get it through a typical HA failover? If I'm doing full clones or something like that, can I take advantage of deduplication on the storage to save space? Does the storage choice that we pick, will there be some type of tiering and caching that I need to account for to make sure that we get the performance? And then View offers, obviously, vSphere has VAI, but there's also the storage accelerator for NFS-based storage, and there's a few vendors that support this today. That I can enable this for linked clones, and it is handing off the creation of my linked clones to the storage array rather than making vCenter create them for us. So it's much more efficient and creates them much faster.
Hey Brian, does
Yes.
View today support like vSphere Flash read cache, or is there something else in View separately for server-side caching?
So I'm not sure if it supports the read cache. I would think it probably would. I have to double check it. But View also has, and I totally forgot this, but they have content-based read cache. So CBRC, I think it's called. And it's only available to View right now. But what it does, if you enable it, you can take up to 2 gigabytes of host memory on all the vSphere hosts that are part of the cluster for View. And it will use that for caching. So it will cache the the bits for the desktop. So it does a pretty good job of saving I/O from the array. So that 2 gigs is, or up to 2 gigs is a worthwhile. And I don't think I've ever seen a host in the last quite a few years that was so constrained in memory that it didn't have 2 gigs that it couldn't spare. So CBRC is kind of the most recent thing for that, unless you look at some type of a third-party product. So next up would be compute. So much like all the other ones, we need to understand the analysis of their current environment. So when I run the tools or do the manual discovery, so I need to look at their average desktops. How many CPUs, cores, how much gigahertz are they using on an average for those? Excuse me, how much memory are they configured with, and how much do they actually consume? So this is going to help us size what our virtual desktops, the VMs would actually be sized for, but also is going to help drive the consolidation ratio. So we need to take these values that we discover and use them for the sizing. And then when we're sizing compute, it's kind of driven. You certainly need to figure out, the raw speed. If I need 300 gigahertz for each VM, I've got to account for that. But more driven is really the desktops per core. So if I've got a boatload of 1 vCPU VMs, what's the ratio? How many of those can I fit on the host? And I typically see customers they kind of bounce between these two ratios. Either they care about the number of desktops they can get per core, which is a lot of how they read in reference architectures from vendors, or still got a lot of people that don't like to put a lot of eggs in one basket. For example, like it would totally freak them out if you built a really big host and wanted to put more than, say, 100 desktops on a given host, because if that host failed, yes, they would HA restart another one, but the thought of impacting 100 plus people to wait a few minutes for them to restart totally freaks them out. So that kind of comes into that spot that, yes, you could technological-wise, if that's the right word, I'm probably butchering it, but it's possible. But you've kind of got to deal with their comfort level. So those two ratios are, you need to find something that works and makes them, feel happy. And I recommend, if you haven't, read some of the reference architectures from the major vendors. So Cisco, HP, even the storage guys have them. Read these ones, but take them with a grain of salt, because they write these with the slant to promise you really huge numbers. And if they're architecting Windows 7 VMs with 512 megabytes of memory, that's not a realistic number, right? So if they can tell you can fit a bazillion of those on a host, you've got to kind of, step back and figure out what might be, am I going to really need 1 gig of memory or 2? And then what might that do to the ratio? Around compute, you've got the decision of whether you're going to allow any overcommitment of memory or I'm going to reserve the memory. So I'm a big fan of reserving memory. It also saves me space on storage. And typically, I'm not going to run out of memory, so I usually run out of CPU before that with these, so I'm going to reserve my memory. Form factors for the compute. Am I going to choose blades, rack mounts, or there's a number of new kind of blade-ish multiple, like these super micro type things where I can fit a number of hosts inside of a 2 or 4 U box. So what type of form factor might I choose, and that might drive some of my storage choices also. And then network options. So am I going to have multiple 1 gig links? Am I going to have a pair of 10 gig links? What choices is my compute offering going to offer me? And then would be determining the virtual machine configuration. So a lot of that stuff we've been gathering. We now, hopefully by now, we know what version of Windows do they need. They run Windows 7 Enterprise. They need Windows 8 Professional. Again, this is going to be a 32 or 64-bit OS. What, if any, applications will be installing to that base image? And this, again, is, keep it as simple as possible. If they don't have the need for 2 vCPUs, then don't give them 2. Much like servers, give them the minimal amount of possible that's going to give them the performance that they want. And then the types of resources for each of these. So how much CPU, memory, and storage does each VM may need? And this may, vary. So how many images are we going to need to satisfy our use case requirements? So I may have 20 use cases, but I may be able to accomplish that with, it'd be really awesome to accomplish it with 1 VM and 1 image, but that's typically not possible. But I'd like it to keep it to as few as possible. And then what, if any, modifications does the customer require to the base image? So do they have a special build? Are you going to allow them to use their typical desktop build, which I would not, right? I want to build a new golden image or base image from scratch and then incorporate the change that they require. Do they have a certain background? Do they have certain tweaks that they make to local policies, or does the rest all come from Active Directory? Figure out what they need. And then when you get pushed back for crazy requests for the customer, they ask for certain things. Figure out, you got to weigh that. You got to put on your consultant hat and figure out what you need to serve because they've asked for it and what kind of doesn't go against best practices. And then if we've got all this data that we collected, that data is kind of your best weapon, right? So if they're asking for multiple vCPUs and there's just no reason for it, present the data and make your case, and then, hopefully that's the, they understand that that's the right choice for that. All right, section 2, view pool design choices. So a lot of what we discovered, through the discovery of existing ones, and when we develop that use cases, we now get to take all that data, and that's going to come into choices that we'll make when we configure and figure out how many pools that we'll need inside of View. And a pool is really a group of desktops, a group of users, maybe a grouping of applications that we all present to a number of people. So based upon the requirements and image requirements is going to help drive us to the number of pools that we need. So different use cases don't always mean separate pools. So if I can satisfy 5 use cases out of the same base image, means maybe my base image has, it's Windows 7, it has Office installed in Acrobat per se, but I can then deliver all of the departmental or use case-based applications if they're all web-based, or I can FinApp them and deliver them that way. Then I can deliver those 5 use cases from a single pool in View, unless there's some other reason that we can't, that I'll talk about later. So that plays into least amount of pools, least amount of images, where possible. In View, there's a number of different types of pools, and most every View test that I've seen, the VCP one, they really kind of harp on the pools. So I would say know the ins and outs of pools very well. So there's really a couple types of pools. There's an automated pool, which means it's going to automatically create desktops for you. There's a manual pool. You're going to have to create desktops yourself or via some method and then get them manually added into the pool. Or there's terminal services. It's Windows Server. You're brokering the connection through View. In there, you can assign users in really 2 different ways. You can have floating pool, which means I've got, say, a pool of 100 desktops, and upon each login, View is just going to hand that user a session from the next available desktop. So if they log in now, they might get desktop 73. If they log out, log back in, they might get desktop 22. So it's just going to take the next available desktop for them, versus a dedicated pool. So dedicated, I'm going to get essentially the same desktop each time. Now it may get refreshed, but I'm still going to go to desktop 33 every time I log in. And there's really 2 ways that you can assign that dedicated. You can do automatic. So if I entitle a user to a pool, give them permission to log into that pool, the first time they log in, View is going to automatically assign them to a desktop, and then they're married to that thing. Or I can go in and manually assign users. So if I like doing extra work, or there's some reason that I don't want people to be automatically assigned, then you can go into the View console, and you can say, this user ID, assign them to this desktop. And then how do these affect? So things like local mode that we talked about, you can't do, for example, if you choose a floating pool, you can't do local mode. So understand how some options like that, how you build your pool might affect some options not being available. And then there's linked clones versus full clones. So your 2 types of really how you'll clone a desktop to make it. Full clone is basically a template like you would use in vCenter, and when you create new desktops, View is actually telling vCenter, hey, I need another clone of this, so it's going to make a whole clone of that, and it will use up the appropriate amount of space. So if every desktop consumes 30 gigabytes, every View desktop that's cloned from that's going to take 30 gigs. So that's the piece where, if you could do cloning at the array level or, duplication on the array, it's going to save you that space. And then linked clones is the parent or gold image, and then I get deltas or snapshots of every that. So all my linked clone, the children of those, parent, only take up the unique amount of data that each desktop uses. So, and you can, or used to be able to, I think they just switched, I used to be able to control how much that could be. Now I can just tell it if it refreshes on a schedule or every time somebody logs off. But only that unique amount that, the user creates of unique data consumes space until that desktop gets refreshed. So if I flush those changes on every log off, then each linked clone is going to consume a very small amount of space. So it's a good amount of space savings for that. So I would definitely understand exactly how that works and the associated disks with those. And then you look at the drawbacks and benefits of both. And then you need to understand how you can customize those desktops. So how's it going to give it a new GUID and change the name? So there's a quick prep option built into View, or you can build a sysprep answer file, much like you can in vCenter, and tell View to use that, or really your two options. And with linked clones, quick prep is a very popular answer. It's faster at, at doing that process. And why might you need to create a different pool? Obviously, image. If you have some reason, different OS versions, different sized VMs, need different apps in the base image. Some type of image reason will definitely drive the need to have a separate pool for some use case. Possibly policy and security reasons. So maybe I have a real big pool of hundreds of users, but then I've got a small pool of like 20 users. It might be the same image, but those 20 users might need external access with the security server, and I don't want to give it to the big pool, so I may create them a separate pool, tag that pool for access, or maybe I'll allow some people to use USB and some not, so I may apply the policies via that. Would be a few reasons potentially to have different pools. Some more pool choices. So if you have access to View, or you can do, yep, go ahead.
Hey, sorry. Question came up in chat. Is there a particular reason why you would use sysprep over quick prep now?
It's been a bit since I did that. For me, the biggest reason to use quick prep is the speed. Sysprep is a bit more thorough, and you could do some of the, if you needed to do maybe some first run type things that you could do with a sysprep type action, then you may have the need for that. But I haven't had a customer in any time, for years that had a need that they had to use sysprep for this. So I've always used quick prep.
Okay, cool, thanks.
All right, so like I said, if you have access to View, go in and create some pools and look at all these settings. If you don't, there's probably a hands-on lab you could do from VMware, but I would definitely recommend getting in there and looking at all these. So whenever you create a pool, there's a bunch of settings like policies and choices. So in pool settings, you need to choose like, how you're going to handle power. Do you want these VMs to be on all the time? If it's linked clone, what are my refresh choices? Each time a user logs off, do I want it to refresh that desktop so it reverts back to a clean state? You need to control the desktop protocol. So am I going to only allow them to connect to the desktops via PC over IP, RDP, or am I going to give them the option to use both, and then they could actually select? So would they have the need to use PC over IP like when they're in the office, but maybe they're somewhere and RDP might be a lighter, like less bandwidth intensive, so do I need to give them that access to it? Typically, I don't see people using that. It used to be a bit more desirable years ago, but it's really PC over IP today. You can also control maximum display resolution from this. You can choose whether you'd like to put any limits on flash media use, so are you going to throttle it? And then there's provisioning choices. So there's a naming convention. So in a desktop pool, you'll choose how you would name those desktops, and then they're enumerated with some number. And you're going to say, how many desktops do I want this in this pool? If I want 100 desktops, I can choose, do I want to create them all right away when I create the pool, or do I only need like 20 of them now? And then View will just say, okay, I want this number of spare ones, but then as my spares get low, it will just start creating new ones. So I always have like a buffer of 5, and then that number will just creep up to the maximum of 100 as I add users to it. How are you going to handle the profiles for users? Typically in each pool. So usually I don't see people using multiple versions of profile management, but technically you could if you needed to handle things differently in different pools. How are you going to handle the patching of the desktops or the base images? So if they're full clone or persistent desktops, you typically have to patch those like a regular Windows machine. So you need to account for that. You have some method for that. If it's a linked clone, you've got that parent image for it. And there's not like an automated way that thing's not powered on, so you have to kind of build a process around taking that image or taking a clone of that image and then doing the updates for that, and then kind of leapfrogging your versions of the image in to update and recompose your pool to get the changes. Application presentation. So I put some of my applications in the base image, and if I do that, then how am I going to update them? If they're full clones, I've got to update applications the same way I always would. But if I put them in the base image for linked clones, then much like how I take a copy of the golden image and I have to patch it for Microsoft patches, I now have some applications that I'll have to patch in there. And then if they're thin apps, how can I present thin apps? So with how this test is now, they really just care about view and thin apps. So you've got kind of a limited number of choices. So you can present thin apps via view, but it's pretty rigid. So I can only present a thin app to a pool or a desktop. If I present it to the pool, everybody in the pool gets it. So the part where we talked about, well, I had 5 use cases and they were all in one pool, this would cause you a bit of a problem if you wanted to present your applications or thin apps via view, because if I wanted to present an accounting application that was thin apped, but I only wanted the accounting people to get it, then I couldn't present it to the entire pool. And if I present it to a desktop, then the user has to get the same desktop every time, which is maybe not the behavior that you want. So then outside of that, I'd have to look for some other way to present thin app applications. And I could do that via login script. There are some third-party profile management tools that would allow you to present a thin app, which of course wouldn't be on the test. You could potentially present them with a group policy that you could do that, but that may require you to have a separate OU, which might drive, again, the use case to have a separate pool. So you kind of got to understand, we want to consolidate, but there may be some things like this that drive you to have some separate pieces. And then how are you going to entitle users? Am I going to just add users to the pools, or am I going to hopefully create, Active Directory groups maybe on a per pool basis, and then, entitle my users to the group, which automatically entitle them to the pools. And a few more pool choices here. So OU requirements to meet the policy needs. So typically, most designs will typically create its own OU container on a per pool basis in view, because the group policy then can be contained on a per pool or per OU, which matches up with the pool. And then if I load those Active Directory templates that come with view, then I can control things like PC over IP bandwidth, minimums, maximums, audio, quality. I can control it on a per pool basis rather than for my whole view install. So if I need to limit some of those for some users and not, then I could have a separate OU and a separate pool for them. Otherwise, I have to enforce it on everybody. And then monitoring requirements. So there's a lot to monitor here. You still got to monitor your host, your storage, your networking. You've got desktops and you've got user sessions, which is not typical to your normal server virtualization. So I've now got people in other sites connecting to a desktop session, which is probably the most visible to them. So if there's latency or not enough bandwidth there, then their user session is going to suffer. And you need to be able to ascertain why they're having a poor user experience. Is it due to latency, or was it fine, but then it started to suck, and that's because they started watching like 3 YouTube videos and downloading, the latest whatever CD of music they like. So that's why VCAPs for View is a great tool for this. Don't remember if it's actually in the blueprint, but VCAPs obviously does all the great monitoring that VCAPs does for the infrastructure. But the View one adds in all the desktop session-based stuff. So I can actually see the session statistics that are populated via WMI counters when you install the View agent in those desktops now. So I can see how much bandwidth PC over IP is using. I can see how much latency their session has, the stuff that you need to help you troubleshooting. So that's why having a tool like VCAP's review is incredibly important. Otherwise, you'd have to wing it or try to find another tool that could look at those counters. So then another option for presenting applications, and I've even come across this, is the applications are kind of one of the more difficult pieces, right? I mean, you can install Vue pretty fast. It's not incredibly different if you buy good storage and hardware. It's not incredibly hard. I can make images. Even if I make a bad image, I can still have a decent user experience. But the applications take a while to package, so a lot of people tend to cheat, or they tend to do what they've done historically. So I've literally seen people create linked clone pools and then still present their applications via Altiris or SCCM. So that means when a user logs into a linked clone, it's fresh, it's a vanilla image, and then there's an agent in there, and then it says, hey, this guy's entitled to these 5 apps, and then it reaches out to SCCM, and it has to suck all those images down and install, the old school way, like when you used to get a new PC. So if they're doing something like that, how would this affect, the user environment, and obviously what you'd want to, steer them away from. And then what restrictions for assigning thin apps via View Manager? I actually talked about that, how it's bound to either the pool or the desktop. And how will we delegate administration? This kind of comes back to the manageability. So if I've got that greater team, or maybe I have an admin team from different business units, and we just want them to be able to manage some portions of this. Vue obviously has role-based access controls that you can set up, so I can enable groups or just user IDs, and I can use folders within Vue that I can create folders and then nest the pools, Vue pools under those folders, and then assign my rights at the folders in Vue. So this allows me to just allow an admin to have access to a certain pool if I give them rights to that folder. So spending some time with that and understanding how the role-based access stuff is, I think, pretty important. And so that's my last slide. This I thought I'd throw in. This probably gets covered a lot, but these are some basic VCAP things that I've noticed or people have told me over time. So time management's a big thing. There's a lot of questions on these tests, and even though they're a couple hours long, there never seems to be enough time. So these questions are very long, and then even the answer choices are really long. So you got to kind of read fast and try to make your decisions timely. Practice the design tools. So the Visio type app that they use for these. There's a test one on the VMware website that you can try so you can get used to the interface, so that it's not a cold turkey thing when you go on there. And there's also a number of drag and drop questions. So it might be, this is my design and these are my constraints, and drag these and that matter and into the right and left columns. So those are actually my least favorite question. They also seem to eat up a ton of your time because you got to read a bunch of paragraphs and then read all the different little takes. So if there's a sample, I forget if there's a sample out there, but try to do some research if you've never done a VCAP before, and just kind of be prepared for those. And that brings us just to questions. So open questions, I guess, about the topic before we wrap up.
Anyone out on the GoToMeeting got any questions? There's been a lot of conversation on Twitter. As always, Jason and a few other folks, Colin, have been great. Sean Massey's been throwing some tips in there as well. So had some good conversation going on while you've been presenting. Hand raise, anybody? Any hands? Any hands? Mark Trimble says, good session. Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Brian.
I would say, a couple years ago, Vue and end-user computing was kind of a pretty desolate land, but there's a lot of people that have created a lot of good content in the last year, a couple of years about it. So it's not so much of a mystery that you have to kind of learn this new. There's some really good stuff out there by a number of people. So much better than when I first started, certainly.
Excellent, excellent. There was a question that came up on Twitter we're trying to get answered, whether printing is covered as part of this exam, and Linus Bork just dropped a note in that printing is part of the persona. section of the blueprint. Did you come across a lot of that in your prep?
Certainly there's, yeah, I mean, obviously can't speak to what may or may be on the test, but in real world scenarios, printing can become a crazy thing because, you know, there's some location-based printing that you can do, or, you know, do they print based upon IP? Are they going to just pass through the printers that are on the existing PCs? So I would definitely agree, you know, understand what's available in the product, because, you know, especially like in the healthcare market that I've done a lot of business in, there can be some tremendous printing challenge based upon the applications that they used.
Excellent. Not seeing any other questions pop up, so I think with that, Brian, thanks for coming on tonight. For the folks that are here, had to drop out, just getting in, we'll get this uploaded shortly, and keep an eye out for it. It'll hit the Twitters and professionalvmware.com tomorrow. Any last tidbits before we go?
No, I think I'm good. I mean, thanks for everybody coming and giving me the chance. And I mean, if you know another question comes up that you know I can answer, you know, reach out to me online. I'd be happy to try to answer it if I can.
Great, awesome. Thank you very much, and have a good night, everyone.